In the front, I have here a 200 millimeter Phobya fan or radiator, and this is 36 millimeters thick, which I think, in terms of static pressure, is a great match for this AP 181 Silverstone fan in the front here. It's all copper, so there is a little bit of discoloration that you get from that copper. It's got a filled drain port on top, which is great for testing. In the back, I have an Alphacool UT60, which is 120 millimeters by 60 millimeters deep. It also has a filled drain port and comes with all copper hardware. Great radiator. You do need a lot of static pressure in a pool configuration on this particular heatsink or this particular radiator because it's so thick. So I chose a Scythe Gentle Typhoon AP14 GT, which is a 1450 RPM fan that's running in the back here, and it's doing a great job with this particular radiator. I did get a few bent fins on the Phobya. I didn't get any bent fins at all on the Alphacool. Build quality, paint and finish seems a little bit better on the Alphacool. The stickers are a little crooked. It would be nice to have those stickers just included for manual application. But in general, both radiators came in great shape, and I'm really impressed by them. I like the adapter plate here that works with all sorts of fan sizes, so it just perfectly fits in this case once you remove all the extra hardware like the drive bays here, which are removed by a couple screws, and the CPU support mount here. So that's really great, and that's why I like this case so much. So after we have the radiators in and everything, I will mention that you need to carefully choose your hardware. Every little piece matters for a water-cooled build. You really need to plan it thoroughly. The screws that come with both of these are total junk. The heads are way too small for any case, let alone a case that has screw holes for fan mounts as large as this case. You will need to get new screws. I recommend ordering them in advance off the internet. If you're like me and you didn't, that's one detail you missed of your build, I recommend Ace Hardware, because all the Lowe's and Home Depots I visited or called pretty much laughed at me when I tried to purchase or find metric screws. The two Ace Hardwares I went to both had 3mm M3 metric screws, which was a great find, I thought. So keep in mind, this isn't a 25mm fan, this is a 32mm fan, so we need to adjust accordingly to mount this. In my opinion, a perfect fit would be a 37mm screw with a 0.5mm washer on the front so that it'll fit with these large screw holes. But unless you go custom and you cut the threads yourself, you're not going to find that. So I'm running a 40mm with two washers. The downside of having those two washers is the head length pokes out a little bit. So my fan filter on the AP181 is a little bit convex from this side. It's okay. Maybe in the future I will get better fitting screws or cut them myself. I just didn't want to risk puncturing this radiator. It would have been really bad, especially considering this is my first water-cooled rig in a very long time. For the back here, I'm using 30mm screws with one washer on the heads, and it just barely threads into the radiator. There's so little thread left with that 0.5mm washer on. I was surprised considering this fan's only 25mm. So in general, I would say you want an extra 5mm on your screw over your fan size, so 32 to 37 or 25 to 30, but how you will need to use your 0.5mm washers will also affect how much thread you have left, so you need to be careful there. But that is another detail to keep in mind that a lot of people forget about. So I figured I would mention that. And before I forget, I don't use these drain ports to drain my rig, and you notice I have no quick disconnects, and I don't have a fill line or anything like that. The way that I fill this case is through the fill port on the top of the reservoir, and then I tilt the case backwards to move the water through the system. How I drain this rig is pretty funny, but it'll actually drain the entire rig in about 10 minutes, which isn't bad at all. I release one of the front caps on the reservoir. I tilt the case and flip it with the front facing downwards and put a bucket underneath it as well as a towel. Then I let most of the water drain out. I tilt the case forward, see, you can see some of the paint there scratching off, and I'm very careful with my cases. And then what I do is I put towels in the system, and I will disconnect usually this compression fitting because there's not much water running in here because it'll be drained out. And then I just blow a little bit of air into there to move the rest of the air out of the system. And it works fine. 10-minute drain, not bad at all. And it looks pretty clean. An EK Supremacy on the processor. I have an EK Titan on my GTX 780. Both are full copper, no nickel plating, and both have the black acetal top, not see-through. I really like the EK blocks. They perform very well. Installation couldn't be simpler. The manual's fantastic. They even include some GC Xtreme thermal compound with the CPU block, which is fantastic compound. And they included all the thermal pads for the Titan. Very easy installation. Just make sure you have the appropriate hardware. You're going to need a Phillips number 2, a Phillips number 0, and a T6 head. And of course, make sure you're in a mood to use a pair of scissors, because you will need to cut out the thermal pads yourself for the GTX 780. I wish they were pre-cut, but if there's any errors or there's a problem with one of the pads, it's fine because you can cut more. I will note that the instruction manual, which covers the placement of the actual thermal pads on here, was missing a picture for one of the areas where there's an indentation in the block. There's 2 small inductors there, and because there's that indentation on the block, like with the other components, I went ahead and put thermal pads there because they were extra left. It looks like those were next to pretty important VRMs, so I would do the same. For my fittings, I went with bits power. For my rotary 45 degree and 90 degree. For my straight fittings, I went with the EK compression fittings. Just to note, I went with a 1/2 inch inner diameter tubing by a 3/4 inch outer diameter. This is the thicker tubing, which of course is an age-old argument. I like the thicker tubing because I think it looks pretty cool. Of course, we don't need to get into flow rate differences or, bend radius, but it is what it is. The downside with this tubing is that the fittings are much more expensive, especially the compression fittings, but I really like how it looks. The Bits Power fittings are great. I haven't owned the Bits Power fittings, but I've heard a lot of hype about them. Believe the hype. The rotary fittings are fantastic. The paint quality on here is great. I thought I wouldn't like the little decal on here, but it's pretty cool. Even after multiple compression fitting tests on here, the paint hasn't come off the threads, which is remarkable considering the matte EK fittings already have most of the paint chipping off. So that's really cool, at least I thought. This tubing is the Primo Chill Primo Flex Advanced LRT. It's supposed to not have plasticizer seepage issues. One thing to note, this new tubing, at least in my opinion, versus tubing I've used in the past, and I think I have actually used Primo Chill in the past, it's a lot less flexible. It's very rigid, so it looks nice, but if you're, if you maybe think there might be a little bit of leeway with some of your runs, think again and replan, because this tubing will not bend very much at all. I really wish I would have used a 45 degree fitting up here, but this runs fine. It's not great. There's a little bit more flex than I'd like, but I probably will have to live with it. If I ever go SLI, I'll get an SLI bridge here, and then I'll get a 90 degree angle off of the second card, and that'll just go right up to the reservoir, and it'll be fine then. But I just have to live with this setup for now. I really like the Scythe GT fan in the front. Great fan. At low RPM, there is a little bit of motor whine if you put your ear up close to it, but it's not bad at all. Moving back to the blocks, do note that your inlet-outlet placement does matter. It doesn't matter on this card, or on this block for the video card. Just make sure, this is a good tip for newbies because sometimes they don't realize this, you need to stagger on GPU blocks your intake and outflow. Doesn't matter the order, it doesn't matter if you have intake here, your inlet outlet's flipped. Just make sure they're staggered, because if they're not and you just have it pass straight through, your water's not going to go through the block. It's just going to go directly through the port here, and your card's going to overheat. The order does actually matter on the EK Supremacy block. You need to make sure your inlet is the port closest to the center. Otherwise, you're going to see 8 Celsius degree higher temps, and I actually tested that, and it does hold. And they do talk about that in their manual, so make sure you keep that in mind. Another thing to keep in mind if you're new to water cooling, when you're leak testing and when you actually get your build up and running, make sure that afterwards, after a few days, you go back through and you retighten all your fittings, because the temperature variance will oftentimes result in the tube shrinking or flexing a little bit, and there'll be a little bit more give, so you will be able to tighten those fittings down more. Make sure you only hand tighten. A lot of people think they need to really get in there, and it's like they're doing a plumbing setup or something, so they'll just yank the heck out of their compression fittings and damage them or leak in their system, which is a terrible thing. You just need to hand tighten these, and a lot of times, depending on how your tubing or your run is set up, they won't even tighten down on all of the thread all the way. You will see a little bit of a gap, and that's normal, and that's what's to be expected, so don't be frightened by that. I know the first time I used compression fittings, that kind of weirded me out a bit, and I think I even damaged a set of compression fittings, which, once you see how expensive compression fittings can be, is not something that you want to do. Overall, I'm really happy with the components I picked for this build. Make sure you plan thoroughly, and I really like this onyx color on this tubing. It's a nice black color, not brown like a lot of people seem to say on the internet. And again, make sure you have all the appropriate hardware. I like the Cobalt screwdriver set from Lowe's. It has pretty much all the heads you need for electronics, T6, Phillips 2, Phillips 0 for the video card, really helpful. Don't use the double drive because you will end up damaging your screws on these delicate components. Also make sure that you have some sort of ratcheting tube cutter with this thicker tubing. You can get them for 10 to 15 bucks at a hardware store. If you try to use scissors on this thicker tubing, you'll probably have a really sad day. So get that tube PVC pipe cutter, or get a really nice box cutter and cut directly down with that razor blade, or else you're going to have a mess. And just as a note with those ratcheting pipe cutters, to open it, you actually have to apply quite a bit of force to separate each of the legs. And then once it clicks out, then you just ratchet it down with your hand. And they won't include instruction manual because most of the people buying them will have used them before. So if you're new to that, don't be scared with using those. They are pretty scary looking tools, but they work really well in water-cooled builds. And I am running distilled water through this rig. I don't really care for coolant at all. I don't care for dyes. And, you know, if you want color, use colored tubing like I'm doing. It achieves pretty much the same effect. You know, I guess it's a little harder to bleed because you sort of have to just feel the tubes around for air pockets. But that coolant will oftentimes gunk up in your blocks, and you'll have to have the fun task of removing your blocks and cleaning them out with a toothbrush, which you don't want to do. And in my experience, your coolant maintenance period is usually much more frequent than if you just use distilled water. With coolant, I remember having to change out my coolant, you know, every half year. But with distilled water, I've had rigs run for well over a year without any issues. Just make sure your distilled water does have a biocide added to it. You can use a kill coil if you want. I don't, because I like to try to minimize my use of different metals. I like to just use all copper and with a little bit of brass. I don't really want to mix in nickel or silver or anything. So I actually use copper sulfate, and you can buy copper sulfate very cheaply in a small container off of the internet, and you just mix, you know, 5 drops into a gallon of distilled water, and you're pretty much good to go. You won't have any nasty algae growth or anything in your tubes.